Good evening. Well, as Abe said, I am from a little town a few miles down the road that way, Hillsborough. I used to come to Wilmington and play the Hurricanes every once in a while, a few years ago. As you know, Hillsborough, probably similar to Wilmington, a social conservative, religious town. You went to church on Sunday morning, you went to church on Sunday evening, you went to church on Wednesday evening. I was raised by my grandparents, and we lived right next door to the church, so it wasn't a long trip to walk across the driveway. I strongly believe then, and I strongly believe now, in punishment of those who violate the laws of society. And I know many people who are in prison now who should never get out. Okay. I worked 32 and a half years in the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections. My last 3.5 years I spent as the director of the agency. I started my career in 1977, retired in February 2010. I worked at Lucasville as my originating prison. I went from there to London, to Lorraine, back to Lucasville after the riot in 1993, to Ross, to Central Office. So I've been the warden in 3 prisons, have worked all security levels. As the director, I had about 50,000 plus inmates, roughly 12,000 employees, and spent on a yearly basis $1.8 billion of your money to incarcerate people in this state, somewhere in the neighborhood of 28, 29, 30 prisons, give or take a budget when we were moving things around. $1.8 billion of your tax dollars go to criminal justice just to operate the prisons in this state. I think that's about 1.5 now. Director Moore, who's a friend of mine, actually just lives a couple miles from me. I currently live in Chillicothe, is the director, and I think his budget's about $1.5 billion. The death penalty was not something I thought about growing up in Hillsborough, Ohio. But when I got to Lucasville in 1977, fresh out of college, I seen this person leave the prison one morning, and that person never came back. And it was a young man by the name of Gary Beeman. Gary was on death row. Death row was housed at Lucasville when I first started there in 1977. Gary served as his own attorney and went back to a county in northern Ohio. I think it was Ashtabula, but don't quote me on that. I just know it was in northern Ohio. Gary never came back because Gary was found not guilty, serving as his own attorney. The inquisical part of me asked what happened to Gary, and they said, well, he got found not guilty. He's not coming back to the prison anymore. I interviewed those inmates who left death row in 1979 or 80 because the death penalty in this state was ruled unconstitutional. So I was involved bringing those people off death row. 1994, I was the warden at Lucasville after the riot. Was the first time we'd taken anybody and placed them in the death house at Lucasville. I took an inmate by the name of John Bird out of cell block at Lucasville, walked him down the hallway, put him in the death house, started what we called the death watch. At that time, inmates had the opportunity to choose electric chair lethal injection. That law was changed, I think, in 2001 or 2. That was when we also did executions at midnight. So on Saturday afternoon, we took John out of death row, walked him down the hallway to the death house, and on Monday night, early Tuesday morning actually, walked John back because the United States Supreme Court had given him a stay. I was the warden at Lucasville in 1995 when we moved death row to Mansfield. During my time period from 1977 to 2010, I witnessed 33 executions in this state and 1 in the state of Texas. So I have been there and understand the death penalty. A lot of people have said to me, well, why has your stance about the death penalty changed? Well, I was a government employee. I was appointed by the governor of the state of Ohio, appointed once by Robert Taft, appointed the second time by Governor Strickland. And I was asked about my stance on the death penalty basically after every execution. And my stance was simply this, that it was the law of this state and my responsibility was to carry out the law of the state. I've since retired, so I don't have to be politically correct. I don't have to tell people things to make them feel good because I'm not running for any office. I don't plan to run for any office, and my stance has changed because of a couple of different things. One, you heard a lot from Tim, fairness of the system. Whether or not you're on death row shouldn't be based on what county you come from, how much money you had, your economic status, or your race. Should not be determined in reference to whether or not you end up on death row. I don't accept the explanation that death penalty cases are given only to the worst of the worst. I've walked the hallways of every prison in this state multiple times. I worked in maximum security prison for 7 years. And I've run into a lot of people who were a whole lot worse than the people that was on death row, and their cases were much worse. So I don't buy the argument about we only save the death penalty for the worst of the worst. Not true. I'll give you a prime example of that. Knox County, Ohio. Maybe 3 years ago, a young gentleman killed 2 ladies, 2 children. The dog stuffed them in a tree. And I told my wife, who's here with me tonight, that guy will not get the death penalty. And she said, well, that's a pretty bad case. And I said, yeah, it's one of the most horrific cases that I'd seen. But he didn't get the death penalty. He got a plea bargain. He's currently in the state prison system doing life without parole. So I don't accept the explanation that only the worst of the worst get the death penalty. We probably live in the greatest country in the world, no doubt. We probably have the greatest criminal justice system in the world, no doubt, but it does make mistakes. Gary Beeman was one of those mistakes. You're going to listen to a person in a little bit that was one of those mistakes. Dale Johnston was another mistake. 6 people in this state have been let off death row because they were found to be not guilty. 140-some people across this country have been let off of death row because they were not guilty. I personally have walked 3 people out of prison who were later to be found not guilty. 1977, I had a young man on my caseload. I started as a social worker in the system. Most people look at me and say, you wouldn't be a social worker. But that's what I started as. But this young man was on my caseload, and he kept telling me every time I'd see him, and we had to do 6-month reviews of institutional adjustment, he'd tell me, Mr. Collins, I'm not guilty. And my response every time was, you may not be, but the law says you are, the court said you are, and so therefore I got to assume that you are because you're here with me. 12 years later, 10 or 12 years later, London Correctional Institution. I walk him out the front door to the steps of that prison, and if anybody's ever been to that prison, you got a big set of steps going down front. We got to the top of the steps, and he said, Mr. Collins, I told you I wasn't guilty. It only took about 12 or 13 years for them to figure that out, but he was not guilty, and the only thing I could say was, I'm sorry. I wasn't the one who put you here, but I'm the one that's letting you go today. I walked one other person out who was doing an aggravated murder case. He'd done 14 years, and eventually found that person who was living in Germany at the time. I walked him out the front door of that same prison. I changed my stance because Ohio has an option, and that option is called life without parole. Life without parole means you will not be released from prison. You do not see the parole board. The only way you get out of prison if the judge changes his mind, if the appellate court overrules the judge's sentence, and the prosecutor decides he's not going to give you a new trial. But with life without parole, you don't leave prison. I hear a lot of people say, well, they could. They can't unless the system had messed up. It's impossible. Life without parole. How many people are currently in the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections? Life without parole became a law in this state in either 96 or 97. Today, I checked their website today. They put a monthly report out. That monthly report has a lot of different things on it. But one of the things it has on it is how many people are currently in the system that are doing life without parole. 474 people as of July of this year were incarcerated in the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections for life without parole. On September the 5th of this year, they said there was 138 people on death row. I wonder if those 474 people would have been on death row if we didn't have life without parole. Because if you look statistically, if you go back and look at history, after 1996, the number of people committed to death row in the state of Ohio dramatically dropped. Sometimes only 1 or 2 a year. But our numbers on life without parole were going up at a dramatic rate. Another interesting fact, and I checked this out today, I knew it to be true, and I've always known it to be true, There's many people currently on death row who never had the option of life without parole. In fact, I asked the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction today, how many people are on death row that were sentenced prior to 1997? Prior to 1997. That means they've been there for 17 years. There's 62 people currently on death row that were there prior to 1997. That's roughly 45% of the people on death row never had an option for life without parole. I wonder how many of those people would not be there if that option was available. Maybe another recommendation should have been we go back and look and see whether or not we should give those people that option as to whether or not they should be there. 62 people currently set on death row in this state that didn't have an option of life without parole. I would venture to say, looking at historical data from when life without parole came into effect and number of people came on death row, that probably 80 to 90% of those people would not be sitting on death row today. I've seen effect on victims after 10, 15, 20 years of the appeals and continued reliving of events. Every execution that I attended, 33 of them in this state, witnessed 33. I would leave my house in Chillicothe, Ohio, drive to Lucasville. Usually left the house 10 till 6. Took me about 40, 45 minutes to drive to Lucasville. Listening to the radio talking about the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections carrying out execution today. I'd get to Lucasville roughly around 7 o'clock, go to the warden's office, sit and talk with the warden, see if there was any other legal action that had been going on throughout the evening and throughout the night. At 9 o'clock, I left and went to the media center where all the media were housed. And it was kind of funny, the first probably 20 executions that we did, a lot of media. The last two, wasn't anybody there. If it hadn't been for a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch, wouldn't have been anybody there. The media even lost interest in what the state was doing. At 9 o'clock, I went to the media center. At 9:15, I went and met with the victim's family that was on site in attendance at the execution. Some of them would attend and view the execution, and some of them were there merely as support. I would leave there, usually around 9:20, walk across the yard to the death house, go in the death house and talk to the team members that was there that was doing the constant watch, and talk to the person that was going to be executed, the condemned inmate, and spoke to every one of them, usually somewhere around 9:30. Things worked on it. You did certain things at certain times, because if you missed it by a minute, somebody was saying, uh-oh, you had a problem. I would leave there and go inside the room where the team members that were involved with the process and talk with them. At about 9:45, I'd get into the witness room where the injections were done and the telephones were there. I would call the governor's office and make sure that there was no last-minute stays and that the governor was not going to grant a reprieve. And then we'd put the Attorney General on the phone, and then we'd proceed. So I got to talk to those victims. And we often talk about the victims of the person who was murdered, but we also had on site the family members of that person who was being executed. They were in essence victims too. And it was probably tougher to talk to them than it was the victims of the family who had been murdered. They were living an event that day where they weren't going to see their loved ones. And we tried to always make sure they were kept separate, and we had somebody from our victim services there. But I think oftentimes we forget about the fact that oftentimes the family members of that person who's condemned were victims too. I've seen the effect on staff who conduct executions, probably the hardest job in this state. They're a fine group of staff from the Southern High Correctional Facility who volunteered to do one of the toughest jobs there is. And believe me, it does change people. I've seen them sweat trying to get in injection sites. I've seen them worry about going to court. I've seen them worry about whether or not people would know who they were because of what they were afraid that people may do to them or to their families. So I've seen that effect. But the one thing that I always ask, all 33 times I went there, did the system get it right? And everybody says, well, Mr. Collins, this guy's had 27 judges look at this case, and you know what? Those 27 judges didn't care about anything other than was the I's dotted and the T's crossed. was the procedures granted. They didn't care whether there was new evidence, whether the person was guilty, not guilty. They didn't care about any of that. They cared about whether the process was carried out. I don't know for a fact that anybody that I ever witnessed be executed was not guilty, but statistical data would probably say that there's a good probability of that. Of the 33 that I've seen in this state and the one I've seen in the state of Texas. I think it's imperative that we educate society about the death penalty and the criminal justice system. And meetings of this nature help do that. People don't really understand the criminal justice system, and they certainly don't understand the death penalty. And I have a lot of friends who have somewhat changed their opinion about the death penalty in discussions that we've had. In closing, I believe that Ohio should do away with the death sentence. It would have no harmful effect on this state for us not to have a death penalty. In fact, it would probably be considered progressive in most cases. We have life without parole, a punishment already frequently used, and is more than sufficient to handle those cases that are of a dire and oftentimes very bad case. I understand it's an emotional issue, and we have to look at the facts and use good moral judgment and social values in deciding what is best for society. I reviewed the task force recommendations. I didn't sit on the task force. I wasn't asked to testify at the task force, but I have looked at the recommendations. To me, they make common sense judgment. I fully support that the legislature takes swift and affirmative action on these recommendations. I know that's probably not going to happen as I stand here tonight, because it wouldn't be the proper thing to do from a political standpoint. And I would tell them that if they were here in this audience. They know that I used to meet with legislators almost on a daily basis when I was the director, and a lot of times they didn't like what I had to say, and oftentimes they didn't like what they had to say. But I believe that they should take immediate action. But I do believe that there's one that should have immediate action tomorrow without pause, without debate, without hesitation, to pass legislation that nobody who is seriously mentally ill will face the death penalty in this state. We don't even need to debate that issue. They don't even have a hearing on it. It could be done immediate, without pause, without hesitation. Secondly, they must enact recommendations on how to support victims' families. Those two recommendations don't even need to be talked about. Should be done immediately. I don't think that will happen, but hopefully there will be some movement to do that. It's been my pleasure to be here with you this evening, and thanks for having us.